quiet street in Rajagaha. Have you ever passed someone on the street and looked away? Not because you were cruel, but because you didn't want to see. A bent figure, dust on their skin, eyes that once dreamed but no longer do. They sit quietly, often near a tree or temple gate, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. This is where our story begins. In the ancient city of Rajagaha, in a time when the Buddha still walked among us. The streets were busy that day. Merchants shouted their prices. Ox carts rolled past with creaking wheels. Children chased each other through the market stalls, laughing. But beneath a Bodhi tree by the side of the road sat a man who no one noticed anymore. His name had long been forgotten, and so people simply called him the Beggar. His robe was patched in so many places that no one could tell what color it had been. His hands were thin, fingers trembling as he held out a small wooden bowl, not in desperation, but in stillness. Each morning he would sit in the same spot. He never spoke, he never asked, he only sat. Sometimes a kind villager dropped a spoon of rice into his bowl. Sometimes nothing came at all. And yet he smiled, not with his lips, but with his presence. A quiet dignity surrounded him, one that no one understood, and so they ignored. The whispers. Some said he had once been a thief, others believed he had gone mad from grief. A few thought he was cursed, born under an unlucky star, but none ever asked, none ever looked into his eyes. Because to look would mean to see, and seeing requires the heart to open. It was easier to walk past. The Buddha approaches Bang that morning as the sun lifted above the hills. A hush fell over the market, not because the wind changed, but because coming, the Buddha, walking slowly, barefoot, his robe as simple as the sky before dawn. Behind him followed a line of monks, silent and serene, each holding an alms bowl. They did not beg, they simply received. Their presence was a teaching in itself, a reminder that peace is not found in doing, but in being. As they moved through the town, people bowed. Some offered rice, others water, some just stood, watching in awe. And then something unexpected happened. The Buddha stopped, right there in the middle of the street, his gaze fixed on the beggar beneath the Bodhi tree. No one else had looked at him that day. Perhaps no one had in weeks. But the Buddha did. He stepped away from the path, walked across the dusty ground, and stood before the man who was called Nothing. The beggar looked up. His eyes met the Buddha's. Time, pause, and softly, slowly, the Buddha bowed. Not a nod, not a gesture, but a full, graceful bow, the kind given to kings or to truth. Gasps rose from the crowd. A monk whispered, "Why? Why does the Blessed One bow to him?" The Buddha smiled and said quietly, "Because this man in another life was once a great king." The past returns. The Buddha's voice was gentle, like the breeze that rustles a leaf before it falls. He ruled not with fear, but with fairness. He fed the poor. He protected the innocent. He walked the path of Dharma long before many here were even born. Now he wears rags. His name is forgotten, but his merit is not. And though his body has grown weak, the seeds he planted continue to bloom. What you see is not all that is. Silence swept across the street. Even the birds seemed to pause their song. The beggar's lips quivered, not because of shame, but because something within him remembered. A face from long ago, a throne, a village saved from drought, a bowl offered to a wandering sage. Tears welled in his eyes, not from sadness, but from being seen, truly finally seen, the karma that follows like a shadow. The beggar sat, motionless, but inside him something ancient stirred, something older than memory, but just as real. The Buddha had spoken, and his words, like gentle rain, softened the dry soil of a forgotten life. And then the beggar remembered. The king he once was, long ago in a kingdom now lost to maps, he had been born under the name Jayasena, a prince, cherished by his mother, trained by his fathers to rule with a sword in one hand and a lotus in the other. But Jayasena was not like other princes. Where others sought conquest, he sought silence. Where others rode horses into battle, he walked barefoot through the rice fields, listening to the songs of workers, greeting the elderly, kneeling to speak with children. He ruled with a quiet mind. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words healed. One day, during a long drought, his ministers begged him to raise taxes to build new reservoirs, but he shook his head. If the earth refuses to give water, let us be the ones who give. And so he emptied the royal treasury, he fed the hungry, he gave gold to farmers to plant once again. He ordered trees planted, not temples. The people called him the king who bowed first, because he always bowed to the suffering of others. The fateful encounter. One evening, as he sat alone beneath a tree, an old sage approached. Wrinkled face, eyes like deep rivers, a robe simple as the wind. The sage did not ask for anything. He simply sat beside the king in silence. For hours, they said nothing, and yet in that silence something passed between them. When the sage rose to leave, the king bowed deeply and offered him his own water to drink. The sage smiled and said only this: "One day, when your crown is dust and your name has faded, you will sit beneath another tree with nothing but your breath, and you will be seen." Jayasena didn't understand then, but he remembered. The fall and the seed. Years passed, the king grew older, his kindness was strong, but his kingdom was not. One day, invaders came. The capital fell, and Jayasena, refusing to flee, walked into exile alone. No gold, no soldiers, just a robe, a bowl, and the memories of his deeds. He wandered for years, and in time, even he forgot who he had been. The world mistook him for a madman, a nobody, and eventually, so did he. But karma is quiet. Like a shadow, it does not forget. The seeds we plant, they do not ask for recognition. They simply wait until the soil is ready. A pause in the present, and now here he was. Old, thin, nameless, and the Buddha had bowed. He had said his merit has not vanished, his path has not ended. This beggar, once a king, is still walking home. The crowd stood in silence. The monks watched with reverence, and the beggar closed his eyes. He could hear the river again, the laughter of children in the fields, the voice of the sage who had once predicted this moment. With nothing but your breath, you will be seen. And he was, fully, completely, without status, without shame.
A deeper seeing, oh man.
The Buddha then turned to his disciples and spoke so gently his words floated like petals. What you see is not the whole story. This man's robe does not define his worth. His silence does not mean he is lost. A life is more than the name it wears. The soul remembers what the world forgets. Bow not to appearances, but to the truth that lives within. One by one the monks bowed, not out of duty, but from awakening, not to the beggar, but to the truth the beggar carried, the last offering. The beggar, whose name no one knew, opened his eyes, but this time he did not look down. He looked up, not with confusion, but with the softness of one who had returned to himself. For the first time in many lifetimes, he felt no hunger, not for food, not for praise, not even for understanding. There was only breath, in, out, soft as a feather on still water. The Buddha still stood before him, eyes open, heart open. And the beggar, who was once a king, smiled, a real smile, not from lips, but from within. He reached into the folds of his robe, torn and grey, and pulled out a single lotus seed. Dry, small, almost weightless. He had carried it for years, not knowing why. Now, he knew. He offered it to the Buddha, 2 hands open, trembling, but peaceful. The Buddha received it as though it were a jewel. And in that moment, the marketplace vanished. There were no crowds, no dust, no noise, only 2 souls meeting again after lifetimes. The Buddha turned to the disciples. This seed, he said, was once planted by a king, given to a dying monk as a gift of devotion. That monk was me, and that king sits before us now. Time is not a line. It is a circle, and what is given always returns. The disciples knelt in silence, some with tears in their eyes, because they now saw not just a beggar, but the echo of generosity echoing back across centuries, his final breath. That night, the beggar did not return to the tree. He walked slowly to the edge of the forest. He sat beneath the stars, the earth cool, the moon quiet. He breathed, and with each breath, he felt lighter. Memories faded, desires faded. Even his name, once so important, dissolved into stillness. And then, as the dawn touched the horizon, he exhaled one last time. Not with fear, not with pain, but with peace, like a candle that knows the sun is rising. The Buddha speaks. When the monks found his body the next morning, the Buddha sat beside it. He did not speak at first, only placed the lotus seed on the beggar's chest. Then he said, "You saw him as poor, but he died the richest of men, not because of gold, but because he remembered who he truly was, a giver, a seeker, a soul walking home now he has arrived." The mirror of this story, and you, dear listener, may wonder what this story has to do with you. You are not a king. You are not a monk. You are not a beggar by the road. But still, you forget yourself. You forget your light. You forget your kindness. You forget that you, like him, have walked long roads through lifetimes of pain and grace. And like him, you carry seeds of truth, of peace, of awakening, waiting for the right season. A closing whisper. So next time you see someone sitting alone, perhaps quiet, perhaps poor, perhaps simply still, don't look away, because what you see might just be a king in disguise, or maybe a mirror. Just as a lotus rises from the mud, so too can wisdom rise from suffering. The Dhammapada.